it was very timely. We have our time slot for a Birds of Feather in IETF 111. I will put the information, I'll paste the information into the notes. But for those of you who haven't been through a Birds of a Feather, the way it works is that you can think of it as an interview for the area director to have some sense of whether there's momentum and community and willingness to actually, create deliverables within a given product space. So, it's important for us to have, we don't have to have tons of people attend this Birds of a Feather, but we need to be able to show that we have a diverse set of people, that it's not just one company trying to railroad a point of view, and that we have enough people who are committed to it that it's not going to languish if we were to charter an actual working group to try to take an actual standard to maturity. Anyone else want to add any comments about why Birds of a Feathers are important? But it's, it's a big deal for us. And the one thing that happened, I think since our last meeting, in fact, all of this has happened since our last meeting, is that they've also asked us to create a charter. And, none of us, with a notable exception or two, are IETF wizards. So, the one thing that we are lacking here is someone who's committed full-time to being, our shepherd from an IETF process perspective. And so that means there are landmines we could step on, right? Where we have all the best intentions in the world, but we didn't understand the process. And so, that's just a risk, I think, that for all of us to be aware of. All right, so I'm going to bring up the actual, one of these is the actual working group, so the working group charter that we're looking at now. It's very short. I will put this link into chat. If we can just take 5 minutes to read it, it really is short. There are two possible drafts here. The second one is written by Mark Wall, and he knows what he's doing. So, so my suggestion would be to click this link, do a quick breeze through. It's very short. Let me just, so, we can review it together. But what you can see is that this bottom piece is the suggestion from Mark, that we would just annotate, like, for example, to make these things links. This is the one that I wrote, with all my lack of experience in what IETF wants. So if you should be able to jump in, you should be able to make changes, you should be able to add things. If we can just spend a minute kind of workshopping this, I think we have to leave this meeting knowing that this working group charter is something that at least we could start with if we had to. Does anyone have any comments, or anyone have any recommendations for how this should look?
One comment, just based on past experience, it's Phil here. I think for the charter, the charter is going to want to mention one, maybe two specific pieces of work that the entire group is behind.
Okay.
And this is my worry right now. We've got pockets of people interested in sub-specifications. That's going to raise an alarm, I think, that, for example, cursor-based pagination, some people really want it, some people really hate it. And so when they call for a hum, you're going to get significant hums against. So we have to do more socialization, I think, on some of these. I have the same concern about my multi-value paging. There are aspects that are cool in it, but I don't see a lot of interest. So I would tend to think that that one will fail. And for that reason, and I'm, that's okay, because I don't really want to do the work unless most of the people are interested in it. And I don't think that's the case. So I think we want to find from this list which ones have to happen. Soft delete is surprising. I think it's still on everybody's back burner because everybody wants a definition about what delete versus suspend means. Because, and I think the key reason why it's important in SCIM, just from the protocol perspective, is that SCIM guarantees a lifetime identifier for the resource. And that turns out to be one of the high value features of SCIM, is that the URLs never break. I've had that pass on to me several times, and I think soft delete sort of finishes that life cycle. But I think that's one of the hardest things we got to work on right now, is to pick the one draft, the key draft that everybody's working on. It's easier if there's a couple sort of side drafts that can sort of be worked on, but even so, they end up not being part of the charter. So all the charter items have to have strong interest from a large audience, and that's part of the the interview, as you mentioned. Yeah.
So is that something? Sorry, is that something that we are trying to accomplish with the BOF by trying to have that birds of a feather discussion, or do we need to know before the BOF happens which of these we focus on?
You wanna have that on the working group mailing list. You want to have it established before. So to give you an example, like in OAuth, the group had been hammering through, often right now in maintenance mode, the group is often hammering through problems that keep coming up, and the group eventually gains a consensus that, hey, we need to talk about something like OAuth 2.1, and it needs to solve A, B, and C. They don't necessarily have agreement on what that solution is, but they want to get it solved. So for example, paging, there might be consensus to say that in SCIM, we've got to support paging. But right now, what we have is two different drafts that do very different things. And what we don't have is two different drafts that propose alternative solutions that can be debated. Alternative solutions suggests there's a common problem, people want to solve it, and this question of what's the right way. What we have is a bunch of ideas right now without a consensus, without an active, I'm going to call it an active consensus to say a majority of people are going to implement it and use it.
Okay, so what if, so here's a first question then for this group. Right now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 specific drafts listed in the charter. If we were going to reduce these to 2, is this group willing to vote right now? Like if you had, let's say we let you put 3 stars beside, so you can only choose 3 of these 6. Could we get people to go into the HackMD and put stars beside the one that they care about? Is that a reasonable, rough consensus mechanism?
Has everyone even read all of the drafts?
Well, fair enough. I mean, I assume if you haven't read it, you aren't interested, but perhaps that's a poor assumption.
Yeah, I think that it's been really helpful in this meeting to go over some of the drafts and allow people to, describe some of the rationale behind why the draft was written. For me, that was definitely the case for soft delete. I read the draft and I came into the meeting thinking that there wasn't a need for it until I heard the discussion and the use cases behind it that weren't as clear in the draft. And I would star that one now. So there hasn't been an opportunity, I think, to have the discussion around some of the drafts for people to necessarily have a strong opinion in some cases.
Okay, that's a good, plus we have a review on today as well, right? So I think we need to, at the very least, let that review occur so that people can understand that draft.
Yeah. And Pam, this is Wes. And so, for example, I know that to me, certainly the pagination filtering is something that is, I think, really important and interesting. Now, maybe I was just taking too far of a step back, but I was thinking that it may be that neither one of these two documents is the ultimate solution, but at least people are poking at the problem from different angles. So I think in general, that topic is of interest. Whether or not either one of these drafts is the winner, I don't really, have a perspective yet.
As it happens, I started to work yesterday on the soft delete draft, which I'll be sending out to the mailing list when I'm done. So maybe that will be a helpful way of getting this moving.
Right. Okay. Let's do that.
One topic that's not on that list, we don't have a draft for it yet, is, I'm going to call it SCIM best practices for now, but it could actually be a set of enhancements or clarifications that would add on to 76, 43, and 44. You mentioned it in the agenda for today about SCIM gotchas. So that's a whole catch area, I think, that are worth clarifying.
Phil, would intention there, would that include some of the things that Matt and I surfaced in our presentation about the privilege access management draft, where the PAM draft solves some sort of general problems very specifically? Is that the kind of thing you're talking about surfacing up, Phil?
Yeah, that might be worth surfacing up, and then it may be that it moves from the PAM draft into a general draft, or it might be that it stays right where it is in your PAM draft, but we generalize it, make sure it's generally applicable, that kind of thing.
I can take neither credit nor blame for the PAM draft, for what it's worth.
Yeah, I think the only issue with leaving it in the PAM draft is that if it looks like it's a specialty area, then general people won't ever read it. And if you want something to apply generally, so that sort of becomes an editorial debate. And yet starting another draft is hard to do.
So is this sort of best community practices you're looking for?
I think there's a bunch of things like best practices. OAuth's certainly gone through a cycle of best practice drafts, mainly because the security threats keep evolving. But there's certainly, we've learned a lot about SCIM and the interop issues.
Mm-hmm.
There are things people don't realize, like why does it matter that the identifier on a resource never change? There is, it's not documented as strongly as I would have hoped, but we developed it under the robust principle, meaning you don't need to worry that schema conformance is 100%. So people need to lay off that. If they're writing code that is so strict that it tosses everything out, they're going to have 1,000 interrupts. This is a RESTful API. It's a RESTful API.
Good point.
So that's something you can sort of guide. It's tricky to give guidance to say something is RESTful, because in the IETF, there's no way to reference that idea to say, what's your definition of RESTful? There is no commonly accepted definition, so you can't reference it. That's an IETF idiosyncrasy, but everybody knows what it means. Like, you can't say today use best security platform practices. You can't say that.
So the other option we have from a BCP perspective is writing basically some best current practices for the different profiles of how people use SCIM. So for example, we have always had two different takes on SCIM, where sometimes it's loosely coupled provisioning and sometimes it's a directory interface, right? And there are, there are different important features of those two things. So, writing a BCP that sits over top of the spec and makes those two use cases or usages clear would be another way to do that.
I think fitting onto that also might be stronger security practices vis-a-vis access management, authentication, authorization, token usage, because we left it wide open saying SCIM is just an HTTP spec, so any HTTP mechanism is allowable. We put in commentary about each mechanism, but I've heard lots of feedback. People would like a narrower set of rules for them to follow. And that's a question of, we didn't nail it down because we wanted SCIM to be agile, because we really saw tokens were just starting to come in as being the preferred access management for an API. But they weren't really in vogue. And so many people are just saying, oh, you have to support basic auth, right? So that world has changed a bit. And a best practice document can talk about that. And then the great thing about a best practice document compared to a draft is it can change.
Right. Okay. So let's do this. Let's jump to the review, the draft review. Talk about that, and then we have Dale here, and Dale's going to talk about the VMware experience with SCIM as well. Hi, Dale. I'm waving, but you can't see me. So I think what we do is we spend the next, 25 to 30 minutes talking through that, and just have some stuff percolating through your head. And then ultimately, all we really need for the working group is to talk about what can the entire group get behind first, right? So even if we just talked about, we could talk about our top 2 drafts or our top 3 work items, right? Without getting too crazy about it, knowing that there's lots of room to do other items afterwards. Does that make sense as a way to make sure we're getting to a working draft that works?
You would, in terms of the charter, at some point, if you want to add new things, the charter has to be amended, but that process is a lot easier.
Right. And right now we can, as far as I know, we can change this charter all we want, right? Until, there's a point where it gets approved, and then at that point we're stuck with it. But right now this is our best effort to explain what kind of work we think needs to happen.
Yeah.
So, my sense is I'd rather get, let's get as much into it as we can and then edit and just take a stab at it. And if we do have to amend, we can amend. If we don't get it right the first time, we'll figure it out. But first we need to, the most important thing is your thoughts, right? This group's opinions have to make it into the document, right? So if you're looking at this charter and it does not match what you think has to happen, you need to just stick a sentence in there, edit the file, put a sentence in there. Because if we don't know where you see an issue, we can't act on it. So, and this is definitely not supposed to be on a track, right? Where nobody gets input.
Hey, Pam, let me just make sure I understood what you said earlier about the drafts of the charter drafts and make sure I'm looking at the right thing. There's 2 of them. One is am I looking at SCIM industry next steps as one draft, and the other one being SCIM reinvention charter? Those are the 2 drafts.
Yeah, these are 2 proposals. One of them needs to get deleted.
Right. I think that, I don't know if you're asking for votes on these, but the SCIM industry next steps has a little bit more of that spirit of let's try and find some areas that we're all interested in.
Yep.
And instead of specific drafts, because I don't know who made the comment, the drafts are sometimes feel like they're poking at certain issues from a particular perspective, and we would probably need to rewrite those drafts anyway.
Yep.
So I like the second draft because it has, or the second draft of the charter, because it has that feeling in terms of the way that it reads.
All right. So shall we just adopt it? Is there anyone who wouldn't want to adopt this second draft? All right. Woohoo! Consensus. We did it. All right. I will. So I will move this to the top. Get rid of the other one. The only thing I will do is preserve the links here. I think the only question is on the paging one, this draft TBD, we actually have to decide which whether this should be a single one or both of the paging drafts.
Well, I think that's what I liked about the wording is that there seems to be this general concern about pagination, either of multi-valued attributes or of large result sets, and maybe we could address that in one draft and have both of those things covered. Just pagination recommendations or something like that. I don't know if that ends up being a best practice or what, but
yeah, I would comment. It might be that they go together, but they are actually
two
very
different
different
things.
ideas.
they're different.
They
Two
are.
different things. Yeah.
Okay.
And
But
There could still be two drafts off of that one bullet item, though. But it is a general area of interest, it seems.
Right.
yeah, there could be an overall paging draft that explains different types of paging and extends the feature. I have a lot of concerns because I brought up cursor-based paging in the first go around, and there was strong opposition about scalability and security threats. It's one of the spaces we were coming from was LDAP and its security threats. One of the reasons people wouldn't deploy it on the cloud is things like anonymous searches and things like that just drain so many resources. They wanted to see SCIM avoid that at every cost. And so when the subject came up, they just said, well, no, in the REST world, you just keep making the same call and you're just going to have to account for some flexibility in the client. So unfortunately, you're going to have to pass that intelligence to the client.
Right.
I think if you have a cursor draft, you're going to say this is for a very specific purpose. It's for a synchronization tool. And that opens up, you can rephrase the draft and say, have a synchronization spec or a reconciliation protocol spec. And that may allow it to get through because you're saying, I'm not putting this out on the general server where it could become a security threat. I'm making this because we need to reconcile and coordinate systems.
Okay. So Jeremy noted in the chat that soft delete is not listed in the SINS version. Jeremy, can I ask you to go put something in that similar vein? I mean, it shouldn't take more than a second, and the link is in the chat.
the link is, unfortunately, I joined the chat after the link got posted. So do you mind reposting the link, and I'd be happy to jump in there and try to get it referenced.
There you go. I just put it in there.
Thanks.
Okay. Is there any, I want to finish this up in the next 3 minutes if we can do it.
And the wall draft is in there twice.
The which draft?
Mark Wall's provisioning in the relying party applications, you've listed it twice.
In the SINS draft? In this first draft?
No, in the previous one.
Oh, okay. So I'm going to delete that.
I'm just looking at the markdown page.
Show me where. So in this section, you mean it's twice or farther down?
It wasn't the one you deleted.
It wasn't.
I'm looking at the very bottom of the markdown document.
Okay, so yes, you now move the SINS one up, so it's below that.
I'm just catching up with what you're doing, Pam.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
No, that's my fault.
So I am expecting to delete everything below. So basically, I'm just going to change this to say delete so that you can see everything after this delete section. I'm expecting to delete. The only thing I'm going to do is steal the links from this lowercase, unless there's anything in this second piece that you all would agree is needed. But I like the fact that this is short. It shouldn't have to be a novel. So the real question is, I mean, let's get these folks talking and sharing their experiences and their reviews, and then have you all sort of percolate through this. We'll revisit it at, say, 5-2 just to see. You're welcome to edit this thing in the meantime, especially if things come up as Dale's talking or as the review's going on. Does that work for everyone? All right. So let's. I think what I'm hearing is that everything up to that delete section, if that were the thing we went to the BOF with as at least a beginning, nobody here would be horrified. Is that right? Okay, let's start with that. You can always contact me too. Go ahead, Phil.
I think we need a little bit more than that, a common consensus under another, so it's worth forming a group.
Okay. Do you want to
Soft
try?
delete is a relatively simple one.
Do you want to try and throw some text in there?
Yeah. What's the interest in privilege access management? That sort of seems to come up. It's just another schema.
Well, there's a recording of the presentation that Matt and I gave. I think it was our second meeting, if you want to go into more depth on that one. But there's a number of issues with the current draft, and we think that some of the things in the current draft are worth bubbling up because they're sort of solved very specifically for privilege access management, but are more general problems that should be handled by the SCIM spec more broadly.
So maybe there's 3 subjects, and we don't have to have. It's nice to have a draft proposal on the table, but you don't have to. But the 3 subjects could be cleaning up SCIM and adding a best practice or a general protocol, clarifying protocol enhancements that layer onto the current spec. I have to think about how to phrase that because it's got to be phrased simply there. And then privilege access management and some of the ideas in there are going to go into that other draft I just mentioned or that other charter item, and then soft delete. And we just need a description for each, and then you can mark and say we have a proposal, draft proposal on the table for privilege access management, and we have a draft proposal for soft delete that the group can begin considering. Because once we charter, the group is officially now soliciting proposals, so there may be more than one coming in for any idea.
Right.
So if somebody can write a SCIM a SCIM, I hate saying it, I'll call it a SCIM enhancement proposal. And based on the subjects, I don't know whether that's a 2.1 or whether that's a best practice draft or whatever, but we should sort of get together a list of and clarification points, which we're going to hear some of from VMware today, from Dale, and let's sort of cobble that list together, because I think actually the fixing the gripes about SCIM topic is probably the one that will drive the group, I think.
Okay. All right. So, so Phil, you're going to put some text in, yes? You're going to wordsmith something and get it in there so the group can review?
I'll give it a try a little later, yeah.
Okay. Okay. So on that note, we have an internet draft review, and we have and then we have some implementation experience to talk through. Let's see. Who is our reviewer? Danny, was it you that was going to do the review? That had things prepped?
Sorry, I was on mute. I just started yesterday looking at the soft delete properly to do a review. I just started writing some notes. It's going to be a while.
Okay, so somebody, my brain.
I'd like to get it out.
Yeah,
Okay.
I did software deletes a month or so ago. It might have been on the other call though, Pam.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had a prepped review for last week that we didn't actually go through.
I was able, I have all the slides and I'm prepared to do the cursor draft if people are interested in hearing it.
All right. So we have 27 minutes left, and we have Dale here too. I do think we want to go through the draft if we can, just because I think it affects our charter items.
Yeah.
How much time do you? Matt?
I think I can do it in 10 minutes. I know that everyone says they can do things quicker than they can in presentations, but it's not very complicated. And if there's discussion items that we want to go along on, I think we can move those to a sub meeting where people who want to discuss those can have a separate meeting.
Okay, let's do that. And then that way we give Dale some time too. And, you know, worst case, we schedule more time again and make Dale come back. I mean, that doesn't sound like the worst outcome. So, okay, Matt, if you want to go ahead on that
Okay. All right. I don't know if you're able to see my screen. Can you?
Do you have a link to those slides, Matt, by any chance?
I don't. I can put them up. Can you see the slides?
Yep, looks good.
Okay. But I can upload these easily.
One thing, Matt, it is in presenter view instead of in presentation. Like we can see your slides on the side.
Okay,
don't
I'm
think
fine
it
with
matters.
that. I might actually need that to switch back and forth. I'll just go through these items really quickly. I think the rationale for the draft is important, and then I'll just overview the actual suggested changes from the draft and leave some time for a little bit of Q&A and discussions. The reason for the draft was based off of implementation that we were doing at One Identity to put a SCIM service in front of existing protocols. SCIM is rarely the first API that a developer will create, and it will either sit in front of an existing API or in front of an existing database system. And so in those scenarios, your pagination strategy as a developer has already been established before you showed up. If you're the guy that has the task to implement the SCIM API, you're not going to go back and change the pagination strategy of the underlying API that you're calling or the database layer that you're calling into. And so this was the problem that we encountered in several scenarios where we were putting SCIM interfaces in front of existing systems. Another reason is something that somebody brought up earlier, that this is really something that happens when you want to actually query all resources. So there's an argument out there that in many cases, you don't really need to query all resources, that you should be using filtering and getting a smaller data set. But we found that there's actually scenarios where the pagination is necessary because the use case is I need to get all the resources. So here's a little drawing of what I just described. SCIM is almost always, at least has been for us, a retrofit on top of an existing web API where you've got your SCIM service, it's calling the web API, or in some cases, it'll call into your underlying database layer. And you've already got your pagination strategy kind of dictated for you. And it's either cursor based or it's index or offset based. And it's really hard to inside of this SCIM service without using a lot of memory or resources, switch between those two. It's easier to call through and have the outward facing pagination strategy match the inward one. So in the abstract that I wrote for the draft, if I were maybe doing it again after having had some experience implementing 3 or 4 of these SCIM services in front of existing APIs and database layers, I would change my wording. I think without the opportunity to do cursor-based pagination, it makes it really difficult to even implement a SCIM provider to switch between pagination strategies within the provider. And so I think it's actually something that we need. Yeah.
Just in case there are folks here who don't really know the difference between cursor-based and the other, can you just give a quick basic definition of what cursor-based pagination is?
Yeah, so cursor-based pagination is where, well, I'll just show a real quick example. It's a pattern that you would recognize because it's used very frequently. Here's a list of the web APIs that you might be familiar with that use cursor-based pagination. These are all very highly scalable public-facing APIs, and they use cursor-based pagination, which is the pagination strategy that you have in LDAP too, where you have you get a first page, and in the first page you have a cursor that you use in your subsequent call to get the next page. So that's cursor pagination, where you kind of have this cookie that you pass back in, and you get the next page using that cookie. Indexed paging is what we have in SCIM today, where you say, I want page number 7 and I want 10 results. And I want page number 8. And so you actually enumerate through the pages. Does that help?
That's perfect.
Yeah. Matt, can you elaborate on why you see these systems using cursor versus the index offset?
Well, there's a little bit of religion in it, to be honest.
Yep.
You know, you got your big little Indian tab spaces, VI Emacs kind of thing. So there's definitely a preference, but there's also some technical reasons. And there's some good articles that you can actually put in some references, because I knew that I would upload this presentation, and go and watch a couple of these videos that says that where some pretty educated people that have gone to the trouble of actually editing a video that shows the differences between the different strategies and why you might want to use one in some cases and the other one in other cases. It turns out that there actually is an argument for both. There's not one that's better than the other. Sometimes it's preference that was used by the developer to pick one over the other. And in some cases, there was actually a technical reason for using index or offset paging over cursor.
Yeah.
So I would, it's a little bit beyond the scope to go into the pluses and minuses, because there's, full articles and full chapters of database books written on this topic.
I'll give some quick examples when we get to the VMware section on why we would prefer cursor over index-based.
Okay, so here's the changes that the draft proposes. It's just 2 new query parameters, which you can see in these examples when doing a get. And then so you have the cursor that you passed in that you got from the previous call, and then you have a count, which specifies the number of pages. And then there's 2 new attributes in the metadata of the response, which gives you the next cursor and the previous cursor. Previous cursor in the draft is listed as optional because some databases don't really have the ability to go back and forth on the cursor. They only go forward. So yeah, that's really it. So yeah, here's the, so a few topics for discussion. The one thing that's come up that's kind of interesting to me that maybe we might have a couple of minutes for is the concerns that are had about possibly creating a security attack surface for denial. I think it was described as a denial of service. I think what people are concerned about is a caller creating a cursor and then not releasing the cursor or not pursuing that cursor to get all of the results. And what that creates on the service side is memory allocated for that cursor. I'll preempt with just this slide right here. There are many strategies to mitigate your exposure on cursor allocation. And I would argue that you have the same problem with offset-based pagination in allocation of memory that you would have, at least in a denial services scenario with anonymous searches, as you would have with cursor. You'd use the same mechanisms to remediate that attack surface in both cases.
So Matt, would you recommend, I think what it seems like you would prefer if the world were a perfect place would be that both index and cursor based pagination would just be built into the spec. Like, not that one's an extension, but that we ask implementers to support both. Yeah. So
at least have the opportunity for the spec to allow both. Right now, if I want to implement SCIM, I have to implement offset pagination, which I may not be able to do if my underlying API only supports cursor without completely gathering the entire result set and paginating it with indexes.
Right. But then haven't you pushed the complexity onto the client where some servers would support cursor, so others would support index?
Yeah, but I mean, from a client implementation perspective, if I query the server metadata capability endpoint and I understand one versus the other, it's probably like 30 lines of code for the client to use one versus the other, right? So I mean, you're right, it's pushing the complexity on the client, but from a client implementation perspective, it's not that hard to go one way or the other.
You still have dialects, and it bothers me a bit, but okay.
A point was raised earlier on that you're committed to the underlying cursor system that's in place underneath, because SCIM is often a gateway. That seemed to be an argument against, because if you force a standard, then you can only page one way. And if that's incompatible with the underlying system, then you're stuck.
Yeah. Well, I think what I'm arguing for is both, is that as an implementer, I can choose, and I agree that there is an argument that that pushes the complexity onto the client to pick one. But you can query and find out which the service provider supports. And it is a bit of a catch-22. I'll agree with that.
And which, if I was a developer, I would find that cursor-based paging always works. And if I ever need the second page, I just make another call. So I'll just write it one way.
Yeah.
Does that not raise a concern where you get a number of calls and they only ever load one page?
Well, if they only ever load one page, then you know, I don't know why that would be a concern.
Well, that's why I because you are holding on to, instead of like today, you build together the result set and you return however many answers are good to go, and then you can release them to memory, release that memory. Now you return a cursor. That means you have to hold that in memory for a period of time in case that cursor gets called. That's right. That's where the resumption of concern comes into play. So there is the trade-off between having to gather the information every time in case you need it, versus somebody using that against you to make thousands of calls and never actually call the cursor. And now you're chewing up your resources very quickly.
I think that's an implementation detail on whether memory is and state needs to be allocated per cursor and left outstanding. I mean, if you have an index on a group of objects and the cursor is an indexable value, then there is no state that the server keeps track of.
Right.
I think if you have a million entries, that's a really difficult thing, because with a million entries, the change rate is quite high. Now you have to store a copy of the million entries at the point in time of the first call. It's very useful to do that.
That's one of the things I like about cursors is we constantly get bug reports of people using the index based because an entry has been deleted or added and the page contents change or there's duplicates. Whereas with a cursor, you know, you just get the next page from where they saw before, whether or not entries have been inserted before the cursor.
Yeah. The problem is real. I agree with it. It's how to solve the problem, because you got to store that somewhere. And the argument going back to 2010 or 8 was, look, just pull all the stuff down in one get. And let the client sort it out. Let the client hold the state. And if they need to pull a million resources down, a gigabyte of data, let it do it, because it's cheaper for the service provider.
Right.
The problem
is real. The problem is real. I'm not putting it down.
I think the argument that I'm making, at least in the draft and in this presentation, is that I think it's difficult for people that are trying to implement the standard to be forced to use index pagination. Again, I'm showing the same slide. These scalability concerns that we're discussing are deep conversations, but they've been solved by all of these APIs. These are highly scalable public-facing APIs that are cursor-based pagination. And there are very effective ways to remediate the problems that we're discussing with memory allocation and orphaned cursors. So I think that I don't know if it's worth trying to discuss the validity of the proposal in terms of of those deeper discussions, because they're solutions for them. They've been proven to be highly scalable, and there are some advantages in cursors that are well recognized, like changing data sets. Cursors are well recognized as being the right pagination mechanism for data sets that change, as was mentioned earlier. So I just like the idea of the specification allowing someone to use cursor-based pagination. It doesn't allow it now, and I think that makes it difficult to implement. We could not have implemented, of the dozen SCIM services that we implemented, we could not have implemented about 3/4 of them without actually implementing this draft. We had to have the ability to expose the cursors to the caller, or we couldn't have done it. We would have ended up downloading complete data sets in order to create index pagination.
Right. Hey guys, I'm going to call the time card here, just so that we can get Dale's presentation in, if that's okay. I think what we've determined is that there's interest here, right? And that I think we had at least 5 different people engaged in the conversation. Does it, Dale? Could you get your presentation up? Is there anything else anyone wants to add before we move on? We can schedule a whole day or a whole meeting to talk through this.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to go through this really quick, just hit them all. I think the group should recognize quickly that almost everything I have to say here has already been discussed in this meeting in one form or another. I don't think there'll be any surprises. I do have opinions from various implementation choices. First of all, shout out to Phil. I can't believe we're doing this 12 years later. And talk about a blast from the past. I see Sean Vela is on. That's all right. We're going to talk about meta directories. So cool to see you guys on the call. Let me see. I listened in on some of the original SCIM calls in 2008 to 2010, whenever that was, and it didn't contribute much. But being a directory guy, I was kind of concerned about where it was going. I recently, because I was surprised that you guys were kind of restarting, so I read through the mailing list and was really surprised at some of the drafts that you've been discussing here, like the cursor one, Mark Wall's draft on pushing to RPs. Really good work, and Phil, a lot of the stuff that you did on being able to select what's returned based on path. In result sets, really good stuff. So the primary thing I would say here for the group is really good progress. I have now spent 10 years at VMware, primarily going to product teams saying you need to use OAuth 2, OpenID Connect, and SCIM. Just do everything that way. What has been a problem is that oddly enough, people tend to understand federation because of SAML and OpenID Connect. And they say, we just need to do that and that's it. But almost all the applications need to browse users and groups. And so, we're working on trying to get them to go to SCIM, but we've learned over time I've done 3 server-side implementations, and what was most instructive was working on a client-side use of SCIM. Is that as this group has recognized, we need to move to a push SCIM model for provisioning into some middle tier, as opposed to a pull and cache model. So let me just review this quickly, and then if we have any time for questions, or as Pam said, I can come back. Cursor-based pagination we have multiple systems, like running on top of DynamoDB. We have multiple systems that can't support the index-based pagination very well. But it's also something that in the latest implementation that really killed us, interestingly, because the SCIM server was pulling information from multiple sources because we had mismatched tenancy models. It was impossible to get total count correct. And the amount of code that we had to do to get total count correct. Now, so maybe SCIM was the wrong solution in that system, but the amount of code that we still had to do to get total count correct, where ultimately it may not be correct anyway, because people were changing, inserting users and groups or deleting them while the pages were happening anyway. So total count ended up being, it's astounding how much code we had to do to try to get total count correct. And then we look at APIs like DynamoDB, which they just don't support that. If you make a query if you want to find the total count, there's no way for the system to even keep track of the total count for some of these highly scalable tables. Paged output would be great. I also worked on a system that just said we give out all of the thing about multi-valued and paged output is for group membership. So let's just take group membership out and make it a separate resource and deal with pagination there, as opposed to trying to make general purpose pagination of multi-valued attributes. Just get rid of the offending multi-valued attribute that causes all the problems. So that's one of the systems that we did. We did that instead of trying to deal with paginating group membership. The pushing changes to RPs is great. This is something that we've definitely seen, and now we're on the receiving end of SCIM provisioning calls from Okta and Azure AD, and we just see this as a continuing trend. One of the concerns I have that if we had time to discuss these things, that I'd want to know from this group is what are the concerns about opening SCIM endpoints for on-premises systems to be provisioned from the cloud? So that's something we can discuss if we have time. What else have we got here? This was an odd use case. Only happened in one. This happened in a Cloud Foundry use case. That we had utilities that wanted to be able to, command line utilities that wanted to be able to do things to SCIM objects on the fly as they came up, and it was always a pain to have to make an extra round trip to query the user to find out the ID and then make a call to update the object. It would have been nice to be able to select the object in question, the resource, by attributes other than ID in the update call, but I haven't seen that one again. Everything else has been server side. Soft delete is great. We also get requests for test profiles or interoperability profiles and test suites. They're big. One of the implementation teams in Sophia was a big fan of that, and they said if we would have that would make our life a lot easier. And the other thing is, like I said, we've been just 10 years OAuth 2 OIDC SCIM. Then the question always comes up, well, why aren't OAuth 2 clients SCIM resources? Why do we have to have separate dynamic client registration drafts? Why do we have user info and SCIM me endpoints? These things are always used together. Couldn't we combine them more and have a common schema? So that's all, progress and a few comments. Now I'll get to, you thought I was kidding about meta directories. In the SCIM 2 draft, it talks about, and I see it in mailing list, this debate still comes up, and it came up here, the provisioning versus directory debate. I think that was a comment on the list from Phil. It's not helpful. It's commonly used as both. And not only that, at least two of the systems I've worked on, it's actually used more as a meta directory. You synchronize users in from Active Directory, you have local attributes, you have extended attributes, you may have attributes come in from another system. This thing is starting to look like a meta directory, and we need to keep the authoritative source of the attributes straight. So it seems, there's a high level comment, but it seemed odd to me in the last SCIM RFC, that it talks about tenancy as being tenancy per client. I really see this as being more of, whereas one client can't see another client's attributes, but it's not clear what the shared attributes are, who can update them. I've usually seen more use cases where there are multiple clients some are authoritative for attributes. They want to see each other's attributes for valid reasons. So it would be nice if we had something like external ID where each client has a value of external ID, but they can see each other's. So that's something that I would that's not something I see discussed in this group, but something that I would find interesting. This is my last slide, and I've got 1 minute. I've certainly, in one implementation, we decided to not go with SCIM because they felt like the server resources would cost too much. It was too difficult to implement the full spec. And instead, we just got beat to death because we had these simple APIs, but then they wanted a little bit more. Then they wanted a little bit more. Then, oh, there's a role assignment. Can you return the role definition with each user when they do that? Now, in the role definition, can you return the groups that have this role? And it just, the amount of barnacles that grow in the APIs become worse and worse. We would have been much better off if we just said implement SCIM. SCIM is what you get. So, back to merged, we had another case where it was merged page output from different sources. We're moving to a push SCIM model from pull. But one of the, at least in that particular implementation, I've done a bunch of reading recently on, and I wonder, why are we doing this at all? What in the system that I was working on, I wonder if GraphQL would have been a better thing, because we're pulling data from multiple sources. They've already handled, the pagination issues, and it automatically handles this notion of fetching, preventing overfetching and underfetching. Maybe there's something that we could learn from that in this working group as well. And it is time. So that's all I got. A little bit of a fire hose.
All right, I know people are gonna have to drop soon. I'm gonna, if it works for you all, I'm gonna set up another Wednesday meeting for next week, because I don't feel like we got through enough through the charter to make sure that we're representing the requirements of this group. So I will put that on the calendar. I will use this time zone rather than the Asia friendly time zone, unless anyone disagrees right now. But hopefully that works for everyone. And we basically next week we have to get it finalized. So that's the plan. Any objections? Does anyone want to be more involved in the charter creation than they already are? If you do, volunteer in the chat. Otherwise, I will go through the changes that are being made in the charter, and I'm going to try to push a first kick up to GitHub so that it's memorialized, and I'll try and do that today. So if you need to get stuff in there, I think there are things out of Dale's list here that we might want to include as well. So things like the graph, whether we want to focus on whether a graph API could work. I
am thinking of Phil's comments early in this call about how to get it narrowly focused enough to be able to get it through IETF, and I would completely defer to Phil on that. I think a lot of this stuff resonates with things the group is already doing, and I would love to back that. But the really high level general stuff like the tenancy issues, I'm not sure where that fits in trying to actually get a draft through.
Okay, cool. All right, any last comments before we drop?
I think I wouldn't mind getting people to describe on the list very quickly their use cases for using cursors. And don't talk about how you've done it or what it is, the cursor type you're doing. I'm curious as to why. What problem is it solving? What is the actual technical case that triggers the want for the cursor? And because I've sort of teased out, there seem to be many different things, and there's often a different approach. And so one of the solutions might be simply a best practice approach that we all have sort of come to. But there might be a common technical thread that emerges from the use cases. But I think there's a wide variety of use cases that people want cursors for, and it would be interesting to know what they are.
Sounds like a plan. Are you willing to just send that initial mail to the list to ask to solicit that?
Sure.
Okay, perfect.
Sure.
All right. In that case, have a great Wednesday, everyone, and we'll see you next Wednesday, same bat time, same bat channel, unless I mess up the schedule and the calendar. So you know how that works. All right.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.